Welcome to Writer, a program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. I'm your host, Frank Green. With me today is Lary, L-A-R-Y, Crews, novelist and writer of, a seasoned writer of many genres.
Thank you,
Welcome.
Frank.
We're glad to have you here.
It's good to see you.
We've been discussing the craft of writing, in particular the craft of fiction, and how you got your start as a writer. I think our audience would be interested in listening how you got started.
Well, at the risk of sounding melodramatic, this is nonetheless true. I nearly died. And what happened was I got cancer, and I was in the hospital, and they were going to do the operation and so on. And I made a deal with God. You know how we all are. We always try and deal with him. And I said, basically, let me live, and I will make a career change and be a writer, which is what I've always felt I wanted to be, but I was scared to try it. And I also said that I'd do everything I could to help other writers, which is why I also teach now.
It's a scary thing.
Oh, yeah.
It's easier to live a long and happy life than it is to write well, I think.
Exactly, yeah.
But so it worked out.
Yeah, absolutely. What happened was just not very long after I got out of the hospital, my job that I had at that time was whisked out from under me. My boss fired me. So I took my wife to Burger King, and I said, honey, kind of a whopper of my own, I said, honey, I'm going to be a freelance writer. And she, swallowed a few times and said, okay. So I got a computer, and this is back in 1983, mind you, when they weren't all that popular. And I started writing magazine articles, because I had found out quickly that that was where the money was. And I made a living at that for 4 years. But like everybody else, you have to feed the soul. And I got to where it just got so frustrating, because basically when you're freelancing magazine articles, you're looking for a new job every other day. So I wanted to write a novel, and I had come up with an idea that fit my knowledge and also that I thought would be popular. And I met an agent at a writer's conference, and I talked to him briefly about it, and he said, send me a little synopsis, a little idea about it. And I did. He liked it. He said, okay, send me the first 100 pages. I did. He said, okay, I'm going to try and sell this for you. I want you to finish the book. And I said, okay, fine. And I said, by the way, does this mean that you're my agent? And he said, yeah, that's exactly what it means. It was that casual. But I spent about 6 or 7 months of 2 hours a day, 5 to 7 in the morning, because I had no other time available to me at the time, writing this first book. And it took him 8 months to sell it. But when he did, he got me a 6-book contract with a New York publisher. And then life is always like this. After 3 of those books were published, the publisher went bankrupt. So I had a fait accompli all of a sudden. But it was great in that I did get an opportunity to have 3 published books very quickly. Overall, they've been selling for years, and overall, they've sold just under 500,000 copies combined. So I have readers all over the country. I've got a lot of fan mail that's been really wonderful, and a few that aren't, of course. Some prisoners, writing me. You think you have an idea for a story, let me tell you, that kind of thing.
Right.
But it's just the kind of thing that I enjoy so much. And then I just sort of naturally branched into teaching other people how to do what I'd done. So that's where I'm at.
Well, it was a wonderful experience going to that writers' conference. You can't always expect to pick up an agent that easily. I think you were really quite lucky. You get to rub elbows with writers and editors and all sorts of people who are interested in the craft of the written word at a writers' conference. I always recommend that people go to as many as they can, as frequently as they can. I don't think there's any such thing as a bad writers' conference.
I agree.
Well, in your fiction, what is your favorite book that you've written, or
my favorite?
And okay. is it also the best one in your estimation?
Good question. Yeah, I think probably it is the best one. It's the second book. It was called Extreme Close-Up. And one of the reasons I liked it was because I had almost 9 months to write it, which is the most I've ever had to write a novel. Also because it was about something I was fascinated by. It was about a movie being made at the Don Cesar Resort Hotel in St. Petersburg Beach. Now, I worked on a movie being made there, so I had a lot of first-hand knowledge of what happened there. And I combined that with some things from the newspaper and some things from my background and some things from my friend's background and so forth, and created what I thought was a pretty good plot. And interestingly enough, it's the only time I've ever written a book where I got 2/3 of the way through the first draft before I realized who did it. That was very interesting. And what was great about that was the person that I had thought had done it before became a wonderful red herring, because I had genuinely thought that this,
Certainly, yeah.
you know, so that was
well,
great.
the story took over, the characters took over.
Exactly.
That's a wonderful discovery and part of the really true creative act, isn't it? Yeah, so you set about to study the craft of writing and the craft of fiction. Aristotle is probably where one has to start
I would think so.
in the study of the craft of writing, the craft of fiction. I was talking with a screenwriter not too long ago, John Fusco, who said that Aristotle and Egri were the two that were probably sufficient and necessary as the two to study. You are strong on the elements of story as story, and I thought,
I'm very deeply based in what, for want of a better term, we'll have to call popular fiction. In other words, fiction that's read by the masses, entertaining fiction, as opposed to something that's extremely literary in nature. For one thing, I don't think I'm qualified to write something extremely literary in nature, but also I choose to be an entertainer. I would rather entertain people with my writing than puzzle them, as I might
well, if you
have
don't
done
entertain them, you're not going to have a chance to do anything else.
Exactly, right. And what I think is very important, what I took from Aristotle, and he'd turn over in his grave if he heard this, was a concept of plotting that I have sort of shortchanged into something called the hook, the joyride, and the payoff. And what that means, as far as I'm concerned, is, first of all, you have to hook the reader as quickly as possible, especially in this day and age when everybody's used to fast-paced entertainment of all sorts. You need to get their attention, either with something happening or with somebody worth caring about or with something intriguing. There needs to be something happening right away. Then you take them on this joyride, which is sort of like a roller coaster in that the protagonist, who is usually trying to either reach a goal or to overcome something, will constantly be striving, and it will almost look like he's succeeding, and then there'll be something new happen, something worse happen, and you keep on doing these reverses until finally you get to the point where he overcomes everything at the end. Then you have to have a satisfying conclusion. That's the payoff. My wife will actually fling a book across a room if there's not a satisfying conclusion to it. Because, you know, you invest all that time reading the book, and then it ends up in some negligible way, like, well, maybe she got it, maybe she didn't. You know? That's very frustrating.
Well, it's awful.
You know?
Well, those attempts by the protagonist to solve his or her problem make the story darker for the protagonist and force that protagonist to go in another direction. And, And I'm reminded Aristotle said that plot is the soul of story. I'm also very mindful of Aristotle's admonition that what gives a story unity is not, as the masses believe, that it's about one person, but that it's about one action.
Yeah.
And I think that when you've got a central character who is in conflict or has a conflict of the human heart, you've got a strong story.
Absolutely. One of the things that I like to do, and it sometimes happens almost by accident, is in addition to the goal that my protagonist is trying to reach, which is pretty much out in the open, in my case it's usually solving a crime, I also want them to gain emotionally in some way, to learn something about themselves somehow, or to get across some universal truth.
Right.
You know, I strive not to preach in any way, but I still strive to have repercussions. There's more to it than there appears to be. My favorite compliment was a man who told me that he read Extreme Close-Up twice, and he said, the second time, you know, he said, I got a lot of things I didn't get the first time. Well, that's great. For popular fiction especially, that's wonderful to have somebody find more than one layer, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. Well, those universal actions that give stories unity are what people identify with. And, you know, in Larry McMurtry's The Last Picture Show, the opening is, sometimes Sonny felt like the only human creature in town. We've all felt that way.
Yeah, exactly.
And the conflict that the protagonist has to confront, I think in order to have a satisfactory resolution, he's got to solve himself. And so many novels, there's some outside force or something other than the protagonist solving the problem that makes for that unsatisfactory ending. The Greeks called it a deus ex machina. But
Yep.
now, some of your favorite modern-day writers are people like Robert Parker and Elmore Leonard.
And I realize that, you know, by admitting this, I'm admitting that, that I'm not as well steeped in the classics as I should be. But on the other hand, I also am steeped in what's popular and what's being read, which for my purposes is a good idea because I'm trying to sell books to be read. Also because some of these people are real craftsmen in various parts of what they do. Elmore Leonard, I think, is one of the best writers of dialogue on the planet.
Absolutely, yeah.
I've learned so much from him, and I've had the opportunity to meet him and talk to him as well, and learned even more from him on a one-to-one basis. Robert B. Parker is one of the only first-person authors that I have read every one of his books, some of them several times. And what it is first person is kind of iffy with me sometimes because there are some characters I don't want to be that close to. Where his character Spencer, I don't mind being Spencer for a few days. I really don't mind it. And I think Hawk, the character that works with Spencer so much, is one of the most dramatic and fascinating. He's almost Shakespearean in nature. And of course, Susan Silverman, I'm madly in love with, as are most of the men who read the books, I guess. But now, that's what I'm saying. If you can engender in somebody that kind of reaction, then I think you're doing quite a job as a novelist.
Well, and first person is pretty much de rigueur in that genre.
Yeah.
And
which is interesting because I don't like writing in first person myself.
it's very difficult.
Yeah, it is. And most of my books are in third person, limited multiple, limited omniscience. And, you know, that, for me, that works well because I like being able to go on the other side of the wall where the killer is waiting so that the audience is in fear, because then at least you're establishing suspense, where just having him pop out from behind the wall is only surprise.
First person is the most restrictive of all.
Yeah.
Henry James said it was the barbarous narrator. And I think he was looking at it from a more literary standpoint.
Yeah.
But it's just so restrictive. I try to encourage people to avoid it for the first 7 years of their apprenticeship.
I think that's very wise. May I steal that from you? I like that. I like that. That's a good idea.
You may have it.
Thank
yes.
you very much.
Well, you're welcome. Well, the movie Get Shorty, I thought was a very fine movie. The dialogue in it seemed so strong, it was almost the reason for its existence in itself.
Yeah. And see, this comes from Leonard's love of dialogue himself. He loves these wise guys he writes about. He loves these people. He loves capturing the way they sound, and I think he really does capture the way they sound. And, you know, you bring up a good point, too, when you mention the movie. Sometimes people are a little alarmed to find that I'm a very big movie fan and that I watch a lot of movies and that I use movies in my teaching when I teach fiction to students on America Online, the online computer service. And they're kind of surprised to find that I use movies as a touchstone. And I don't mean screenplays, but I mean the actual finished films, because there are a lot of storytelling devices used in films that are easily adaptable to writing fiction. Good example is what they call the jump cut. You know, in a film, they don't show somebody driving along the street to the hotel unless something happens in the car that's important. But if nothing's happening, they don't show it. Well, that's the way we should do in a novel. And so frequently in beginners, I see they'll write like every step. You know, she walked to the door, she opened the window, she did this, she did that, she did that. And the audience, the reader, is saying, get to it, okay? You know, they want something to happen. Well, this is a great place to use the jump cut. One of my favorite examples is a man says, okay, you can have the money, be here at 4 o'clock. At 5 minutes past 4, she walked in the door. You know, that's a perfect jump cut, and it's exactly the way it should be.
Elmore Leonard says, I've heard him say at any rate, that he tries to leave out all the things that the reader won't read.
Leave out the
or
boring
reader will
stuff,
skip.
yeah.
Leave out the boring stuff,
Yeah.
yes. Well, who are some modern writers that you really admire? Some others that...
I have to point to the ones that I read the most, because obviously that's a big indicator, you know. Stuart Woods is one that just fascinates me, in that he's such a storyteller. I've read, I think, almost every one of his books, and what's interesting is they're all different, but they're all great stories. He isn't in any particular category. He doesn't have an ongoing detective or anything. They vary. In fact, in one of his books, I believe it was New York Dead, he had a protagonist who was frankly not all that likable. And as I recall, I better not give away the ending, but at any rate, some things happened to him that you wouldn't expect to happen to a protagonist. And still, it worked wonderfully well. It was almost like sometimes you can be so amazed by the capacity for evil of a character that you're fascinated by them, even though you don't necessarily like them. You know?
Right.
He's a master of that, and I really like that. And so every time one of his books comes out, I buy it sight unseen. You know? So that's a tribute. That's
Certainly is.
Yeah.
Well, we've built up in the past decade or a couple of decades a nice body of work, a number of books on the craft of writing itself.
Mm-hmm.
I think of William Sloane's The Craft of Writing, and most recently, Brown and King's Self-Editing for Fiction Writers, which I think everyone ought to read.
Absolutely. That book is so good that I recommend it to the students in my advanced class as almost a textbook for our course, because the advanced class is very much about rewriting and marketing your book. And I tell them this book will help them so much that I almost insist they buy it.
I admire the opening so well, that example they use of Fitzgerald.
Oh, yes.
And then later on, they bump it up, use it again, and show how it could have been done better. And then later on, a third time, show, that Fitzgerald could or would be writing better today if he understood what has been advanced in the craft of fiction since his day.
Yeah. It's a really excellent book and well crafted, and in a way that teaches you to use the craft, because sometimes there are books about writing that are so obscure that you can't get enough out of it to really put it to any use. But this is one that's just excellent. One, by the way, that launched my career in terms of writing was Lawrence Bloch's book, From Plot to Print, writing the novel from plot to print. It's been in and out of print. I think it's back in again. It's an excellent book in that it was very straightforward. One of the first things he said in there was, throw away your first chapter, which is the best advice I could have ever had at the beginning, because so many of us as beginning novelists start with all kinds of background and flashbacks and all kinds of junk in the first chapter when we should get to the story. And when he said that, I literally did it. When he said it, I actually took my first chapter, put it aside, started with the second chapter, and that was the book Kill Q, which got published. So,
well, if your experience has been somewhat like mine, I discover time and time again that the story really starts on about page 40 or page 60. I read these manuscripts that people bring to the workshop, and we critique them, and it really isn't until well into the number of pages, somewhere around page 40 usually, that it really starts.
I just went through an experience you would not want in a million years. I read the first chapters of 200 students over the past couple months. And what I saw in so many of them was that they would start with only one character on stage, so to speak, which limits you to narrative summary, and internal monologue thoughts. It's so boring is what it amounts to, and it is definitely telling, and it's only telling. And until they involve another character, there is no showing.
And somehow they seem to think that that's the easy way to start and the easy way to go, and they're making it about as difficult as they could unless they went to first person. And that's a real shame. I think that your emphasis on movies is a wonderful thing, because if the reader isn't visualizing something at all times, you're really failing as a writer. You've got to have the reader seeing something. And the craft of scene and sequel can be so well demonstrated in a movie and then applied in the novel.
Thank goodness, because it is so hard to teach that. Scene and sequel is so important, but it is so difficult to get across. Somehow, for me anyhow, it's been very complex.
Maybe you can explain for our audience a little bit exactly what we're talking about in terms of scene and sequel.
Well, it's almost like the rule of cause and effect, in the sense that when something happens, there has to be a reason it happened. And if you don't portray the reason it happened, then people can't understand why it suddenly happened. It doesn't just happen out of a clear blue sky. And it's the same sort of thing with the scene and sequel, in that you have to portray what's happening, but you also have to show the extent of what it means to the characters or to someone else involved. It's you can tell by the way I'm trying to explain it how complex it is for me even to get across. But And it really boils down to everything we show in a novel has to have some consequence. Unlike life, novels have to be logical. They have to have some sense of logic, some sense of, you know, this thing leads to this thing. And so frequently what happens with beginning novelists is they just put something in because they want it there. You know, they want to write about a dog going down the street, so they do, even though it doesn't fit or doesn't mean anything.
Do you think I'm correct when I try to explain to people that if they have two people in a scene who want opposite things, the scene is just automatically, almost automatically going to come alive?
Absolutely. Conflict is the whole basis of fiction. If there is no conflict, there is no fiction.
And if you've got two characters that just agree on everything, and then really nothing is happening there.
The only way that can work, and it can work in rare instances, is if there's subtext. In other words, if they appear to be very friendly and cheerful to one another, but underneath it is all kinds of rage, that can sometimes work. But it's such a minimalist thing. You can only do it a little bit and make it come off. So yeah, I agree absolutely with you there, because it's the sort of thing that you really need to create some kind of conflict at almost every point in a story for anything to really happen of interest to the reader.
Well, I know your interest is in popular fiction primarily, but we have some writers like Larry Brown and Clyde Edgerton who are working today, whose work is at once, in my mind, both very entertaining and very literary.
Yes. And I admire them. It's just, I think one of the reasons that I am at the level I am in popular fiction is because at the moment, those are my limitations. You know, I strive to be better, and I am. With each succeeding book, I get better, and I find new things to do. And I'm sort of, I guess, what you could consider almost an intermediate, in the sense that I'm not a beginner. I'm a published author, but I'm also not, you know, way down the road yet. And I want to get right down the road.
Well, it's a lifetime journey.
It is indeed.
And I tell people that if they want to write, they've got to serve an apprenticeship. They've got to expect to become a journeyman writer.
Absolutely.
And hope someday someone calls them a master. Mm-hmm. It's kind of like being called a gentleman. You can't call yourself a gentleman.
That's right.
But I also discourage people from writing. So many people want to have written something rather than be a writer.
Yes.
You know, and
yes.
It's much easier to do just about anything than it is to write fiction or to write well.
You have to really want to do it to accomplish it, because it's not easy. It's the hardest job I've ever loved. That's what it boils down to.
People think, well, you know, in 2 or 3 months they could write a novel. It may take 15 years. Mm-hmm. It's not an easy thing at all.
No, it's not. And one thing I'm finding, my agent had a long talk with me about this. I said, you know, well, here's my idea for my next book. And she says, yeah, well, says, you know, I think you've kind of gone down the road here with the mystery series kind of thing. So I want you to write a suspense novel, maybe a little bit longer than what you've been doing. And I want you to write about something you care about. And I was like, it's like puzzled, like when someone says you can do anything you want, all of a sudden you don't know what you want to do, you know? And for a while I was really stunned. Here's this opportunity to write about anything I wanted to, and I didn't know what to write about. And I finally came to the conclusion, and we were talking before about how sometimes magic occurs, you know, as you're writing or sometimes as you're planning a book, just, you can't explain it, but it just happens. And what happened to me was I was driving along in the car listening to a song by a singer named George Michael. The song was called Father Figure. And all of a sudden I hear the words of his song. I think about my own past. I had a father who took off before I was born, so I didn't really have a father. And I had a character that I was starting to develop, a female detective in Sarasota, Florida, who had no father. And all of a sudden, all this came together, and I found ways to make this resonate throughout the story. The book is called Father Figure, of course, but also because the fact that she had no strong father figure, she tends to lean toward strong father figures, often to her detriment. So this is one of those little miracles that happens, you know. It's sort of a combination of your being in the right place at the right time with the right thoughts and the right ideas, and all of a sudden it happens. That's what I love about fiction.
That seed is planted, and it begins to germinate, and the characters begin to come alive in your mind, and a story results from it.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful thing.
It really is.
Well, why do you teach?
I teach for 2 reasons. One, because I made a deal with God back there when I almost died. I said, if you let me live, I'll help other writers. And the other thing is, I genuinely enjoy teaching. 98%.
You have to talk about what you love.
Yeah, the only 2% I don't like is the reading the chapters of 200 authors.
Yes.
That is very tiring and very time-consuming.
Yes.
And also, I just hate telling them if they're not too good. I hate telling them what's not good. You know,
yeah.
I'm too sensitive
to
their
their
needs.
You get some surprises, or are there some people that come and you think, oh, they'll never do it, and they stick with it and do finally begin to do some things?
In every class, I have some that I call the geniuses, people that just write so well, I can't believe they're not published already. And those are the ones that I simply try to motivate. I say, this is fabulous. This is really excellent. Finish it. You know, you got to do this. Then I have the large percentage of them almost have it, not quite. And those are the people I can help. I can point them in the right direction. I can teach them about viewpoint, which is usually the biggest problem they've got. I can teach them about dialogue. I can teach them to tighten up, to cut out the extraneous stuff. A lot of people try to write like writers, like they think a writer would write. So they use these million-dollar words that just make no sense at all and don't belong there. So I strive to get them to clarify, to be clear, to write clearly. Then I have the minority, maybe 3 or 4 students each time, who don't have a clue, not a clue. To try and critique their manuscript would be literally a sentence-by-sentence situation. And what do? You can't say, well, this sentence makes no sense whatsoever, so write it like this. Now, this one also makes it, you know, you could be doing this for the rest of your life. And what you're teaching them is to write like you do, which is not going to do them any good anyhow if they don't have a clue.
Right.
And those are the ones that break my heart, because I don't know what to do about them. I strive to tell them to, you know, study more, try and get this, and so on. I try to encourage them, but it really hurts. Because you can only encourage them so much. But the ones I love are the ones who make an effort and try. And what's interesting about the classes I teach is my students range in age from 18 to 72. They're in 49 different states across the country. The majority of them on America Online. Right. The majority of them I've never met. Yeah. The nice feature to this is they also don't see me either, so they don't know they're being taught by a bearded fat man. But it's a great situation because I'm able to communicate to them in writing. And what better way to teach writing than in writing?
Thank you, Larry. This has been wonderful talking about the craft of fiction, the craft of writing. This has been Lary Crews, L-A-R-Y, 1R. I'm your host, Frank Green. This has been Writer to Writer, program sponsored by Florida Community College at Jacksonville. Thank you for joining us.